welcome to the Bible for worship here at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this second Sunday of Advent, when our scripture reading is written in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 11, verses 1 through 10. Then a shoot will emerge from Jesse's stock, a sprout from his roots will blossom. The Spirit of the Lord will settle on him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and might, a spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. He will breathe it in through fear of the Lord, so that he shall not render judgment by what appears before his eyes, nor convict on the basis of what falls on his ears. But he will judge poor people by means of what is right, and render a verdict on behalf of common folk through fairness. He will thump the ground with the rod of his mouth and destroy evil by the breath of his lips. Righteousness will gird his hips, faithfulness will be his weapons belt. A wolf will dwell with a lamb, and a leopard will take its rest alongside a goat. Calf and lion will grow fat together, and a small child will lead them. Cow and bear will become friendly so that their offspring rest together. A lion will eat hay like cattle, and an infant will play over the nest of a cobra. A toddler will stretch out its hand over the opening of a viper's den. Neither evil nor destruction will be done on all my sacred mountain, for the land will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as water covers the sea. In that day, nations will seek out Jesse's root, standing as a national symbol, and his capital will be glorious. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is among the most familiar of the messianic prophecies that the church has identified in its first scriptures, the Bible of biblical Israel. Messianic, precisely because it anticipates, it looks forward to the promise of God to be fulfilled through a figure descended from the line of King David, the great King David of Israel. Not a perfect King David, to be sure. The Bible is clear enough about his failings and peccadillos, but he was the great King David who unified the 12 tribes, established Jerusalem as the capital city of this single monarchy embracing the 12 tribes, and who became the model for kingship in Israel ever after. In the New Testament, the messianic prophecies have been applied to Jesus centuries later by those who knew their Bible and who saw in these promises of God something that they had come to know as being fulfilled, brought to its fullness in Jesus. But first, every one of these prophecies started out about something else, about someone else. And that's what I'd like to explore about this passage in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 11. Isaiah, as a prophet, lived in the 8th century BCE. The historical books of the Bible tell us that. They narrate some scenes in which Isaiah, the prophet, actually engaged with the kings of his day. But it's also the case that the book of Isaiah which certainly includes certain prophecies from that 8th century figure, continued to be a significant resource for Israel through the end of its autonomy when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in the early 6th century BCE, and even after the return from exile 50 years later and into the centuries after that. So the book of Isaiah includes material that dates from the 8th century BCE down into the 5th century BCE, a period of as much as 4 centuries. This passage in Isaiah 11 can be fairly clearly dated to the reign of King Josiah of Jerusalem. Josiah reigned in the late 7th century from 639 to 609 before the Common Era. And at that time, the kingdom of Assyria over in Mesopotamia, which had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital of Samaria a century before, that kingdom of Assyria was crumbling. The Babylonians were coming to power. The Assyrians had weakened over that century, and it was clear that the Assyrian Empire was coming to an end. And soon, its domination of the northern part of the land, which had once been part of David's kingdom, and its threats to Judah and Jerusalem in the south, one day soon, those would end, because Assyria as a kingdom would be no more. And the question in Josiah's day was, what comes next? A colleague by the name of Marvin Sweeney has written in his commentary on the book of Isaiah a very clear portrayal of the factors that help us to identify this as coming from the time of Josiah. First of all, this was a time when the very existence of the kingdom of Judah was in jeopardy. Josiah's father, King Amon, had been assassinated. And the question of who would gain control of the country was at issue. That was resolved when some of the elders of the court and those who opposed the revolutionaries who had killed Amon succeeded in putting down the rebellion and installing Josiah as king. The interesting fact is, at the time, Josiah was 8 years old. And so, not only the fact that in the passage that we're reading, the image of a large tree that has been felled, and we might think that it's over. King Amon has been assassinated, and we might think that's the end, and yet a shoot will come, a sprout will spring forth from the root of Jesse. That's David's father. That's what makes this messianic. That this sprout that presents hope despite the felling of the great dynastic tree precisely comes from the root stock of the great King David. And then the images that there will be a child who figures prominently in the restoration, in the new growth, in the establishment of this new messianic Davidic kingdom. It's a child who will do this. And yes, Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king. So those who present this prophecy as being about a small child who will grow up to become the king can clearly have Josiah in mind. Thirdly, what are the characteristics of his kingship and his leadership? Justice, wisdom, righteousness, living fully in accordance with God's will. And it was during Josiah's reign that that scroll was found in the walls of the temple in Jerusalem when some repairs were being made. And that scroll that was found and brought out and brought to the king and verified by the prophets, that scroll was something like the book of Deuteronomy, the constitution for a new Israel, a new Davidic monarchy, as expansive as David's had been, not just involving little Judah in the south, but also including the territory of the north that had been Israel, and even extending beyond that to all that David had controlled. This king will be guided by God's wisdom, justice, and righteousness, and that is exactly what Deuteronomy calls for and promises the king of Israel. Even beyond this passage in the beginning of chapter 11, this section of Isaiah from chapter 10, verse 5 through chapter 12, verse 6, there are two other factors: the reunification of the northern and southern kingdoms of the whole land under this Davidic monarch, and also some themes that tie into the Exodus, imagery of the rod of God's wrath. And we see even here that he will smite the land, he will thump the ground with his rod. That language, and also raising an ensign to the nation, a signal to the nations, that we see in the last verse. These images come together elsewhere in the Bible only in the book of Exodus, chapter 17, in a tradition about the Exodus. And so the notion that in this work, and the theme of God's outstretched hand also appears just after this passage in chapter 11 of Isaiah. So all of these things suggest that it was Josiah the king in the late 7th century establishing his program of reform and reassurance for the people that a great monarchy like that of King David was being reestablished, in which all of the land would come back into the king's control, and in which society would be governed by God's justice and righteousness and wisdom. This all shows that the vision being presented here in chapter 11 is a vision set up by Josiah and his advisors as a way to undergird and build support precisely for Josiah's reform, for taking that scroll that had been found in the temple and using it as the constitution for the new monarchy. And if that happens, this passage promises, then wolves will lie down with lambs. Lions will eat hay like cattle. Those in the animal kingdom who are mortal enemies will raise their children together, and they will feed and grow fat together, and that little child will lead them. There will be no more pain or suffering in all God's holy mountain of Zion where the temple stands, for they will all live according to the knowledge of God. Josiah, the child king, guided by God's wisdom, righteousness, and justice, was a fact for the people who wrote this passage. That was the fact. The promise was the restoration of the Davidic monarchy and the arrival of a universal experience of God's peace throughout the world and all of nature. That was their hope. But history said, nope, it didn't happen that way. Indeed, Josiah's reform didn't even preserve the nation for more than another 2 decades before the Babylonians marched in, destroyed Jerusalem, leveled the temple, exiled the people. And for 50 years, the land languished without any real meaningful presence of leadership or identity from God's people who were in exile in Babylon. Josiah was the fact. Restoration and universal peace was the hope. But history said nope. Centuries later, those who are writing the New Testament, who have had their own experience of Jesus, find that this prophecy is still there in their Bible, in this book of Isaiah. And they, of course, realize that that reign of a Davidic Messiah and the period of universal divine peace and blessing didn't take place. They can see that all around them. But they have a new fact. Their new fact is Jesus, whom they portray, at least Matthew and Luke do, as the promised child king, from whom this reign of peace and justice and wisdom will come. For them too, Jesus is the fact. Restoration is the hope. And what do we know from our perspective? Once again, history said nope. Because we don't have that universal peace. And there is no Davidic monarchy. So for us, as for the New Testament writers, and as for those who first penned this prophecy for the book of Isaiah, the reality remains that God's promise is eternal. That God is always capable of making new things out of fallen circumstances. That the great tree which is felled still can generate a new sprout, a new branch, and that always there is the hope that the new era will be characterized indeed, if not by one directly genealogically from David's line, then at least spiritually embodying God's justice and righteousness and wisdom, and thereby bringing a universal peace by God's blessing. God is eternal, and that is why this hope springs eternal, as it did for the community around Josiah, as it did for the community around Jesus, and as it does for us. God bless.